It was a crisp autumn afternoon when we decided to explore the forest just outside the city limits. There were 4 of us. Mia, the cautious one, always insisting we check maps and stick to trails. Chris, her boyfriend, who carried the snacks and wore a perpetual smirk that made everything feel like less of a big deal. Lara, my best friend since childhood, who swore she could sense places and people like a sixth sense. And me, the reluctant planner of this little outing. The forest was an old one, sprawling across miles of uneven hills and whispering streams. Locals had told me it was called Blackwood, but no one could agree on why. Some said it was because of the way the canopy thickened, letting so little light through that the ground seemed to swallow shadows. Others whispered darker reasons. Stories of people disappearing, of strange sightings, and of an ancient spirit guarding the heart of the woods. We laughed about those tales when we heard them over coffee, dismissing them as superstition. But as we stood at the edge of the forest that day, its quiet vastness felt heavy and unsettling. Still, we were young, curious, and bored. Chris was the first to step into the trees, crunching through fallen leaves that looked like damp patches of rust on the ground. "Come on," he called, his voice breaking the strange stillness. "This'll be good for us. Some fresh air." Lara rolled her eyes but followed, her steps slower, more deliberate. She seemed to listen to the forest as much as she walked through it. Mia and I exchanged glances, her gaze tinged with doubt, mine with mild irritation. I didn't want to be here, but I didn't want to be the one to back out either. So I went. The trail started off wide and well-worn, almost too easy. Birds chirped above us. A woodpecker tapped at a trunk somewhere deeper in the trees, and every so often a squirrel darted across the path. For a while, the conversation flowed easily, punctuated by Chris's jokes and Mia's light laughter. But as we walked deeper into the forest, the air seemed to grow heavier, quieter. The birdsong faded. The path narrowed, snaking through thicker underbrush. Lara stopped suddenly. "What is it?" I asked, catching up to her. She didn't answer right away. Her head tilted slightly, her dark eyes scanning the trees as if looking for something or someone. "It's nothing," she said finally, but her voice wavered. "Don't start with your spooky vibe stuff," Chris teased, but his voice lacked its usual bite. We continued on, though I noticed Lara lingered at the back, glancing over her shoulder every so often. She wasn't the only one. The shadows between the trees seemed darker now, almost liquid, as if they were pooling instead of simply lying still. We came to a small clearing not long after. In the center was a fallen tree, its trunk split jaggedly as though it had been struck by lightning. Around it, the ground was littered with strange carvings etched into stones and bark, spirals and lines that didn't make sense but felt deliberate. "What is this?" Mia asked, her voice hushed. Lara didn't answer. She knelt near one of the stones, running her fingers along the rough grooves. "We shouldn't be here," she muttered, barely audible. Before anyone could respond, the wind shifted. It was subtle at first, just a soft rustling through the leaves. But then it grew stronger, colder, carrying a low, mournful sound that wasn't quite the wind. It was almost a voice. "Did you hear that?" Mia whispered. Chris stood abruptly, brushing dirt from his hands. "It's just the wind," he said too quickly. "Come on, let's keep moving." But the path ahead seemed different now. The undergrowth had thickened, the trees closer together, their twisted branches forming a dense web overhead. The light was dimmer, the air colder, and with every step we took, I felt the same strange sensation, like eyes pressing on the back of my neck. Then came the whispers, faint at first, like the distant hum of voices carried on the wind. But as we moved deeper into the woods, they grew louder, more distinct. Words I couldn't understand, overlapping, rising and falling as though the forest itself was murmuring secrets. "We should turn back," Lara said suddenly, her voice sharp. Chris scoffed. "We're fine. It's just the trees messing with your head." "No," she snapped, grabbing his arm. "Listen to me. We need to leave. Now." Before anyone could argue, the sound of snapping branches echoed from somewhere behind us. We froze, our breaths catching in unison. I turned slowly, half expecting to see another hiker, maybe a deer, but there was nothing, just the trees. And yet, the shadows between them didn't feel empty. They moved, not with the sway of the wind, but with intent. Something was there, watching, waiting. Before I could process the dread crawling up my spine, a blur of movement shot out from the shadows. It happened so fast that at first, it felt like a trick of the dim light, a branch snapping back or some animal darting past. But the sharp, guttural sound that followed wasn't the wind or an animal. It was Chris screaming in pain. He stumbled backward, clutching his hand, which hung limply at his side. Blood dripped from between his fingers, staining the fallen leaves at his feet a dark, almost black red. His face twisted in shock and agony, and for the first time in the years I'd known him, he looked genuinely terrified. "Chris!" I shouted, rushing to his side. His hand was a mess, for deep gashes ran across his palm and fingers, as though something with claws had raked through them. The skin was torn and raw, the blood flowing freely, dripping from his wrist to the forest floor. "What was that?" Mia shrieked, her voice trembling. I didn't see it," Chris stammered, his breathing ragged. He winced as he tried to move his hand, only to cry out again. Then, without warning, Mia turned and bolted into the forest. "Mia, wait!" I shouted, but she was already gone, disappearing into the shadows, her footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Lara hesitated for only a second before following her. "We can't stay here," she yelled over her shoulder. Her voice was tinged with panic, and for once, her usual calm was gone. Chris's grip tightened on my arm. "We need to go," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Back the way we came." I nodded, though my heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. Together, we stumbled back the way we had come, retracing our steps through the thickening forest. The whispers started again, louder this time, almost angry. They weren't just distant murmurs now. They were all around us, circling like a storm. The words were still incomprehensible, a strange, guttural language that felt old and heavy, as if the forest itself was speaking. Behind us, something moved through the trees, its steps heavy and deliberate. I dared to glance back and saw only flashes of it. A tall, shadowy figure, its limbs unnaturally long, its movements impossibly smooth, as if it was gliding rather than walking. Chris stumbled, nearly falling. "I can't." But the forest seemed endless. The path we'd followed so easily before was gone, swallowed by the encroaching trees. Every direction looked the same now, dark and twisting, the shadows pooling like ink. Chris let out a low, pained groan, his injured hand trembling. The blood hadn't stopped, and I could feel the warmth of it soaking into my sleeve where he clung to me. The whispers grew louder, sharper, until they seemed to come from inside my own head. I shook my head, trying to block them out, but they only grew more insistent, more demanding. Then, ahead of us, I saw it, the edge of the forest, the open sky beyond. Relief flooded through me, and I tightened my grip on Chris. "There," I shouted. "Just a little further." We broke through the tree-line a moment later, stumbling out onto the dirt road where we had started. I turned back, half expecting to see it right behind us. But the forest was still, the shadows retreating into the trees as though they'd never moved at all. Chris collapsed onto the ground, clutching his hand, his face pale and clammy. Mia and Lara were still in there. The silence in the small police station was oppressive, broken only by the scratch of a pen as the officer in charge jotted down our account. Chris sat beside me, his injured hand now hastily wrapped in a bandage we'd gotten from a first aid kit in their supply closet. His face was pale, his expression distant, as though he wasn't entirely there. I felt no better. My hands shook as I recounted what had happened, every word feeling unreal even as I spoke them. The officer, a stocky man with tired eyes, leaned back in his chair when I finished, his gaze unreadable. "You're saying something attacked you? Out there?" "Yes," I said, my voice hoarse. "And Mia and Lara, they're still in the forest. You have to send someone. Now." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, a younger woman who stood by the map pinned to the wall. Her expression was tight, worried. "We'll organize a search," the man said finally. "But it's a big forest. If your friends kept moving, it might take some time to find them." "Time we don't have," I snapped. "That thing, whatever it was, is still out there." The officer didn't argue. Within the hour, a search team was assembled. Volunteers, a handful of deputies, and a K-9 unit. Flashlights and radios flickered to life as the group prepared to enter the forest. Chris and I were told to stay at the station. We didn't argue. Chris was in no state to do anything, and the thought of stepping back into that forest was enough to make my stomach churn. The search went on through the night. We stayed at the station, waiting for news, but none came. Every time a deputy radioed in to report their position, I held my breath, hoping to hear that Mia and Lara had been found safe. Each time it was the same. No sign yet. By morning, the forest had begun to feel like an endless void, swallowing every effort to penetrate its depths. The searchers emerged for a brief rest before going back in, their faces drawn and tired. The officers tried to reassure us that this wasn't unusual, that people got lost in the woods all the time and were usually found within a day or two. But their words felt hollow, especially when I saw the way they avoided looking me in the eye. On the third day, hope began to dwindle. The searchers found nothing of Mia. No footprints, no clothing, no sign of her at all. It was as if the forest itself had erased her. Lara, however, was a different story. They found her body on the fourth day. The news came in the early hours of the morning. The officer who delivered it, Deputy Morgan, looked visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she set her radio down. "We found one of them," she said. Chris and I were led to the edge of the forest, where the searchers had set up a perimeter. Beyond the tape, I could see the edge of the forest opening into a grassy clearing. That's where they'd found her. Lara was lying face down, her arms stretched out in front of her as though she'd been crawling. Her clothes were torn, and her bare feet were covered in scrapes and mud. She had almost made it out. The Trilene was only 20 yards away, 20 yards from safety. She was running from something, Morgan said, her voice tight. The path she took, it was erratic, like she was trying to avoid something. But the strangest thing— "What?" I asked, my throat dry. Morgan hesitated, then pointed to the small flag that searchers often leave behind when marking a safe route. It was stuck into the ground a short distance from where Lara had fallen. One of the teams passed this area hours before and left the flag to mark the way out. If she'd stayed near it, she would have been found sooner. I stared at the flag, a cold chill running down my spine. It was so close, almost mocking in its simplicity. If Lara had stayed near it, if she hadn't panicked, maybe she'd still be alive. She didn't just run, I whispered. She was chased. Morgan didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. The coroner arrived shortly after to take Lara's body, and Chris and I were ushered away, back to the station. The officers told us there was nothing more we could do, that the search for Mia would continue. Mia wasn't coming back, and neither Chris nor I could explain what had happened out there without sounding insane. To this day, I can't walk past a wooded area without feeling the weight of those shadows, the strange whispers that still echo in my dreams. I think of Lara's outstretched hand, reaching for safety she would never find. I think of Mia, lost somewhere in that endless maze of trees, her fate sealed by something none of us could understand. And most of all, I think of the forest itself, silent and ancient, watching. In the days that followed, my mind became a battlefield. Every memory, every moment in that forest replayed endlessly, looping through my thoughts like a broken record I couldn't turn off. I tried to rationalize what had happened, convince myself it was a predator, a freak accident, something that made sense. But deep down, I knew better. The forest wasn't just a place. It was alive in a way I can't explain. And it didn't want us there. I keep thinking about the moment Lara bolted. She'd been so sure we were in danger, so certain we had to run. But why didn't she run back with us? Why had Mia followed her into the depths of the forest instead of staying with Chris and me? If they'd made a different choice, if we'd made a different choice, would things have turned out differently? Would all four of us have made it out? But the forest doesn't work that way. It doesn't give second chances. I think about Mia a lot. She was smart, smarter than me in a lot of ways. She wouldn't have gone far unless she had a reason. So what happened? Did she get lost in the endless, twisting paths? Did she hear the whispers, the way they seem to pull at you, unravel your thoughts? Or did that thing find her the same way it found Chris? And Lara, I can't stop seeing her face. Or rather, the way her face was hidden when they found her, pressed into the dirt as though she couldn't bear to look back. She almost made it out. I keep repeating that to myself, as if it means something, as if it could somehow dull the ache of losing her. She was so close. I asked Deputy Morgan about the flag again, later that same day. Why didn't she just stay near it? I'd asked, my voice breaking. Finally, she said, sometimes people panic. They think they can outrun whatever's scaring them. Or maybe they don't trust the markers. I've seen it happen before, but I don't think Lara panicked. I think she knew staying by the flag wouldn't have saved her. I think she was running for her life because she felt it closing in on her. Something she couldn't fight, couldn't face, couldn't escape. I can't shake the thought that she might have been the only one who understood what we were dealing with. Lara always said she could sense places, that she could feel when something wasn't right. That first moment she stopped in the woods, when she ran her fingers along those strange carvings, she must have felt it then.